you know, the rapidly rising I don't know.
So that's the candidate that's running for president of the United States, Joe Biden. He's still doing the wandering, incoherent, lying about civil rights stuff. Joe Biden is uniquely culpable for the criminal justice system that we have at our disposal right now. That people, believe it or not, you might not be hearing much about it, those people are still out there marching. Right here. Look at them. Still marching. Whatever you want to think of the demand that was made, defund the police, it is a credible demand. Again, this is not eliminating and abolishing the police department. The argument that people are basically making is, look, you have two ways of doing criminal justice. You can invest in communities to ensure those communities are thriving and healthy, which at that point, the police become somewhat redundant because those communities aren't screaming for cops in order to hold order. The Judge Dredds of the world. They wouldn't be there to dispense maximum justice if those communities were thriving and healthy, or at the very least, the number of times that they will be dispensing maximum justice will be minimized, since, again, they would not be necessary for those communities. Or you can allow those communities to fall into disrepute and to try to use cops in order to stem that disrepute. Now, here's the catch. Throwing in cops can never do that, because the issue here is the inequality. The issue here is the poverty. Now, the defunding the cops thing says take some of the money that you continuously throw into cops as if cops is going to solve a problem that they're no way capable of solving, and put that money into thriving, into making sure those communities are thriving. That's the argument that's taking place. The policy prescriptions that Black Lives Matter have put out directly deals with this notion of the way cops engage the communities, different ways in thinking of dealing with those communities, one of which, poverty. That's the conversation. Yes, the naming is unfortunate, especially in the political sense, but what they're asking for is infinitely rational. Nancy Pelosi, the person who's head of the House, the woman in kente cloth, the woman that kneeled for 9 minutes, shockingly, comes back and is asked this question of, what do you think about defunding the police? Now, we already know what Nancy Pelosi thinks. Despite putting on the kente cloths, she has a leaked memo that basically said, don't listen or don't back Black Lives Matter policy positions. Listen to them patiently. Otherwise, ignore what they're pushing. She kneeled in kente cloth. But the reality of it is, don't back the policies. Because at the end of the day, those policies get to this notion of poverty. She also said, or the Democrats, we need to stop this defund the police talk. They don't like the framing of it. They don't like the naming. It's too provocative. It makes people think that they're trying to get rid of cops. Instead of dealing with that, instead of explaining that, instead of your political instrument being attentive to what those millions of people who are out there protesting are talking about, Nancy Pelosi, when asked, gives a gobbledygook speech of incoherent rhetoric that gets into talking about women's issues when she's specifically asked about defunding the cops. I shit you not. This is horrendous. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This video is not going to be long, but I do want to continue to hammer on this point that the reason that those people are in the streets is because their political instrument is inattentive to what they want. This is shown just in the very basic point that 88% of Democrats call for Medicare for all. 70% of the population, Medicare for all. Pelosi, God of the House, Cobra. Joe Biden, if Medicare for all passed my bench, I'd veto it. If that doesn't get across to you how inattentive your political instrument is, I don't know what is. A black person murdered. A person kneels on his neck for 9 minutes. And the best that the Democratic Party can give is performative trash with her and the other Democrats kneeling, and a bill that is basically a showpiece with no potential to get passed. Best they got. Now, keep in mind, for those people who say vote, there was a black president where Black Lives Matter started. Amy Klobuchar was the attorney general at the time where Chauvin murdered a man in 2006 like Reyes, shot other people while on the job, and she did nothing. All up to the point where now this person's murdered. The chokehold that was used against Eric Garner during the Obama tenure was illegal. Pantaleo walked. I'm making a point to you that this notion of vote, to put this in perspective, the black president who gave 95% of the income to the top 1%, who had a beer summit when the professor was locked up at his door. I'm trying to get across to you that voting is not the thing that is going to get you what you really want, for that matter, what these protesters are basically asking for. That black president who gave 95% of the income to the top 1%, let homeowners go bust, stood by while people who ferociously voted for him drunk lead water, was the one to push out the guy who was calling for police reform and giving income and growing those communities all the way back in the 80s. If voting was going to fix this, it would have done so 40 years ago. Nancy Pelosi is asked basically about defunding the police. Nancy Pelosi could have said anything. She could have explained it. She could have digged into the details. She could have talked about how she was going to deal with power. She could have did anything. Basic question. What do you say about defunding the police?
What do you say to the activists who are calling to go further or to defund police in some cases?
Well, I think we should go further. That is to say, there are provisions that relate to Violence Against Women Act. We think that we should pass that. We passed it in the House. It's in the Grim Reaper's graveyard right now, but we think we should pass the Violence Against Women Act. Domestic violence is an issue that is a cause for concern that police or firefighters, everyone is called in on, and that causes danger to life. The issues that relate to mental health, we need a very strong mental health initiative in our country. We know that. And I think that would be helpful, because I don't think that our law enforcement people should be taking responsibility completely for the mental health and well-being of the American people. Many of the people in prison now have mental health issues. So we really have to address some of this in a little different way than just law enforcement.
What about defunding police, though?
Well, it isn't. We need to have more resources to do what we need to do to fund the Violence Against Women Act, to fund our initiatives on mental health, to address some larger issues which contribute to the injustices that exist, whether it's education, whether it's economy, whether it's jobs, whatever form of economic involvement, business creation, access to credit. The list goes on and on of injustices that we must address.
Nancy Pelosi was asking a very basic question. The origin of that question basically boils down to cops kill 1,000 people a year. From 2013 to 2019, 99% of those killings resulted in 0 prosecutions. Put that in perspective for the moment. Our political system is full of rot. Basically, lefties bought into this notion of blue no matter who. Do you realize that the majority of the people who don't vote make $30,000 a year or less? They don't vote because they realize that what they want and what they need in the political space, if they put in the energy, is not back to them in material gains. I've spoken to people who say, don't give me this politics stuff. It doesn't matter who I vote for. They're so marginal that there's not a vast difference between the two that I can see from where that person is put in that I vote for versus me getting anything back from it. They're not wrong on that. In this very specific case, yes, there are a multitude of issues. But the origin of this case has to do with the way our political instrument, doesn't work. That's the origin. This is being talked about in these terms. But basically, you have people who want things, the majority, especially if you're talking about just Democrats. She's a Democrat, right? And then making that argument about, look, people want health care. They want you to extend Social Security. They want the elimination of all student debt. They want increased taxes on the wealthy. These are things that the majority of the public want. Even if in this, you want to consider this issue somewhat contentious. You could talk about this issue, about defunding the police, in a multitude of ways. You chose to run from this and talk about this in terms of women's health. This gets exactly to my point about what is wrong here. Consider what took place. A cop kneeled on a man's neck for 9 minutes. 40 million people are out of a job. You have just as many people without health care. The best you can do is COBRA. Beyond that point, you're going to have an eviction avalanche coming up in the next few months, as the government that is supposed to be attentive to the needs of the public hasn't been. You have 30 million people who haven't gotten their checks, $1,200. The people who probably needed it the most. I hope you understand what I'm saying here. 100,000 people are dead. 1,000 people are dying a day. You have suicides in the United States that have gone up a third when they've gone down everywhere else in the world. You need to account for that. Why does your country have such opioid abuse? Why do these diseases of despair proliferate in the United States? The overwhelming majority of the people were living paycheck to paycheck before this happened. Before. Do you realize that in the richest country on the planet, 44% make $18,000 or $18,000 or less? What is your life like living off that? Put that in perspective. You think those people are entirely in the streets because a cop murdered a person? And for the moment, even if they were, your question and the conversation that you had in no way touched that. 1,000 murders a year. Our nearest neighbor, 3. You're telling me about women's health. The majority are white. But we're talking about the disproportionate nature and the way that cops tend to engage people of a particular racial persuasion. This is not about women's health. I understand you don't want to have this conversation about defunding the police. It bothers you. It plagues you. The statement is provocative. So what? All of those people are not out there for no reason. Those people are out there because they realize their political system in no way can deal with what they want and their concerns. And so realizing that they couldn't dump this into any bucket politically, they went on the streets. God bless them. For the longest time, those people voted blue no matter who. And in the same way that having no accountability rotted your political space, whereas opposed to having some level of accountability, something that's objective that makes a Democrat as opposed to a Republican, it was entirely relative. And as it being entirely relative, having no accountability, believing in this nonsense of blue no matter who, what happened? We've allowed rot to take place in our politics. So as opposed to having a party that says, yes, we're going to deal with that, you instead have this nonsense. What does it mean to have no accountability in your political process when all of this money is in the process, when 90% of the races are won by the most cash? Rational actors is to go by the side by the most cash. After all, you've removed all accountability because you said you're going to vote for blue no matter who. Terrified of the Republican. Missing the point that Republican that you're so terrified of in the 80s is now the Democrat that you're stuck with going against Donald Trump. How successful has that method of voting been? And whatever the voter shaming and everything else nonsense that you go along with, the majority of the people, many of the people, aren't buying it. It's the reason why year after year in your presidential elections, you have less and less people voting for your ends. Because the reality of it is, the people who you need to back you, or who would have backed you, stop voting. That's your base. Those are the people who would have typically voted to your ends. People of color. Basically, people of color and people who are making $30,000 or less. If that level of rot happens in your political space because you've removed all accountability, what does it mean when 99% of cops that are involved in killings, and over 1,000 killings take place a year, get off? Even if you want to keep that conversation there, you could have even spoke about that. The reality of it is, the black body was a commodity being brought into this country. Any conversation about blacks is stuck about the conversation about class and capitalism. Nancy, who's a capitalist, will never have that conversation, which is why I tell you your political system is inattentive to that. To get to this notion of poverty gets directly at the heart of why the Democratic Party has moved so far to the right. The cash that is ensconced in our political system creates certain perspectives, certain ways in which they lean. And what all of these people in the streets, many of them seeking redress of their grievances from the standpoint of cops, you must understand the black body as a commodity that had legs and the potential to understand that it was a commodity, understood that it had no way in accessing the value of the fact that it was a commodity, despite the fact that it was a commodity. This legacy has stuck to itself. I always say history sticks to itself. And it's dragged itself into the house to which we're discussing now. The reality of it is that the issue that we really need to deal with is poverty. That is the issue they can't touch. And even in having a conversation about policing, for whatever reason, you can come up with your own conclusions. That is a conversation that Nancy Pelosi does not want to touch. She could have talked about poverty in earnest. She could have talked about policing in earnest. There's all sorts of ways she could have had this conversation. The Democratic Party is in no way capable of dealing with the angst, the rage, the indignation that is out in the public. And that means that those people basically need to stay in the streets. And I will be there with them. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.